Good evening. On behalf of the Trinity Forum and Fuller Theological Seminary and InterVarsity Press, I'd like to welcome you to this evening conversation with Mark Labberton, President of Fuller Theological Seminary. My name is Bob Freiling. I'm publisher of InterVarsity Press, and we have had the privilege of publishing 3 of Mark's books. Now, I imagine that you're aware that the publishing industry is something that is a rather challenging venture these days. In fact, someone has suggested that publishing is like shooting a gun in the air and hoping a duck flies by. Well, although that application may be appropriate in some situations, it is not true with Mark Labberton's books. InterVarsity Press is a very intentional, missional publisher. We seek to serve the academic world, the world of the church, and our broader society with thoughtful books that connect biblical faith with significant, complex issues that face our culture and our own personal lives. And Mark's writings and his presence and his teaching really not only fit in that vision, but also embellish it and elaborate and take it further. So Mark, it's been a great privilege to be in partnership with you with your writing. And speaking of partnership, it's good to be back with the Trinity Forum. And I do want to thank Cherie Harder and all those at the Trinity Forum for sponsoring this evening and all the work that goes behind the scenes in putting this together. It's always good to be with you. We feel like we share a common DNA in the sense of vision and values. And it's just great to be with you all, and thank you all for coming this evening. But now I'd like to turn things over to Cherie Harder, the President of the Trinity Forum.
Thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction, and welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us for tonight's evening conversation with Fuller Seminary President Mark Labberton on his new book entitled Called: The Crisis and Promise of Following Jesus Today. On behalf of all of us at the Trinity Forum, I'd like to thank our friends at both Fuller and InterVarsity Press in sponsoring tonight's event. I'd like to add particular thanks to my friend Bob Freiling, whose vision and initiative really helped make tonight possible, as well as to Mark and his colleague at Fuller, John Yasuda, who has been an absolute delight to work with. We're also very pleased that our trustee Doug Wilson has joined us. And we're delighted that each of you are here this evening. If you have friends who wanted to be here but could not be, we'll be recording tonight's conversation, which you can watch on video at www.ttf.org. We'll also be live blogging and tweeting this event, so you can join either at #TrinityForum or follow along on our Facebook page, and be sure to look there for photos afterwards. For those of you in the room who may not be familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues, and by sponsoring programs such as this tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And certainly some of the great questions of life surround our own vocation and calling, what our lives are about, what we are to make of our gifts, time, and resources, how we should understand our purpose in the world, and how we should order our priorities as a result. They are daunting questions with enormous consequences, both personal and public. And they have been tackled with extraordinary verve, vision, and insight by our speaker tonight, Dr. Mark Labberton, in his new book entitled Called. Dr. Labberton is currently the fifth president of Fuller Theological Seminary. He previously served as the chair and director of Lloyd Ogilvie Institute for Preaching, as well as the chair of John Stott Ministries. In addition to spending 16 years as the senior pastor of First Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, California, He co-founded the Christian International Scholarship Foundation to help fund the advanced education from leaders from majority world countries. He holds an MDiv from Fuller, as well as a PhD from Cambridge, and has taught at the New College in Berkeley in addition to Fuller. He also serves as a senior fellow of the International Justice Mission, whose leader, Gary Haugen, we hosted an evening conversation just a few months ago. And he's written several books, including The Dangerous Act of Loving Your Neighbor and The Dangerous Act of Worship. And of course, his most recent work, published by our friends at InterVarsity Press, which we've invited him to discuss tonight, is entitled Called: The Crisis and Promise of Following Jesus Today. Over the next half hour, we're going to hear from Dr. Labberton, and at the conclusion of his remarks, we will open the floor to audience questions. Please wait to be recognized. Please frame your question in the form of a question, and please wait for the microphone to actually arrive so that we can record it on tape. And at the end, if you still have not had your question answered, please submit it via our open forum at Facebook or on Twitter. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very, very much, both Bob and Cherie, for your warm welcome and for the willingness of all of you to come and be part of this evening. I'm grateful for the chance to talk about this book, but I'm more interested, actually, than talking about the book in talking about the issues that the book is trying to raise. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope that at least this first 30 minutes will give enough provocation to be able to take the conversation forward and for us to have good exchange as we do this. I do come tonight as a theologian and as a student of the Bible, and so I want to begin because my own remarks and understanding of call really does arise out of the Bible. I'd like to first give you a very broad overview of how I think the Bible understands issues of call and vocation, and then in particular talk about the issues within the book that I think are ones that are worth our giving some consideration to tonight. So the text that I'd like to draw from is a text that comes from the Psalter, Psalm 8, and it begins at verse 1. Hear these words. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You have given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the birds of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. This psalm is a psalm that in a certain way I think sketches a framework that I think is worth using tonight as a frame for understanding vocation and calling from a biblical and Christian point of view, and then we're going to zero in on some of the particular issues that I try to address in the book. The first interesting arc of this psalm is really the psalmist's astonishment that there is a God who pays attention to us. This is the wonder, right? The image of the psalmist is this sense of standing out under a clear Middle Eastern sky, looking at the stars, being taken up by the beauty of that amazing array, and then observing, who are we that you, O God, should be mindful of us? The word that's used there in Hebrew is a word that really suggests a sense of God being attentive, paying attention, seeing, perceiving, engaging, considering, weighing us. Who are we that the God who makes all of this universe is a God who would pay attention to us? That's the first action of the psalm. The second is that our lives as human beings are lives that are meant to pay attention to God. This is the psalmist's demonstration. So God pays attention to us, but the action of the psalm is the psalmist being caught up in paying attention to God. God pays attention to us. We pay attention to God. And a great deal of the psalm and a great deal of the Bible, of course, is given over to these two actions. How does God pay attention to us? How do human beings pay attention to God? And the third great movement of this psalm is really, after that observation, then the psalmist simply observes, And what has God given us to do? The God who makes human beings a little lower than the angels. That God is a God who then asks human beings, calls, commissions human beings to pay attention to the world in God's name. So it's these three interesting movements. On the one hand, first, God pays attention to us. You might even say, daringly, God's call is to pay attention to us. And what is our call? In part, it's to pay attention to God. And then secondly, it's to pay attention to the world in God's name. Now, it's those three actions together, which it seems to me really capture the themes of a biblical vision of what it means for human beings to be given gifts and abilities and vocation in the world, in which we are meant to engage in some of the most primal and profound works of what it means to be human. First, God pays attention to us. This is the great biblical affirmation. Outlandish, scandalous, not accepted by any means by many, many people. As a pastor in Berkeley, California for 30 years, I can tell you, not accepted by many people. I'm not in any way presuming that you accept that. I'm just affirming that the biblical vision is that there is a God, and that God pays attention to us. Now, it's interesting that in the New Testament, this becomes, of course, highly intensified through the way in which the claim of the New Testament that God has come in Jesus Christ to be a God who pays attention to us at really close range. This is the nature of the biblical claim of the incarnation, that God has come to be among us, to pay attention to us, to perceive us, to identify with us, to share with us, to engage with us, to enter into our humanity. One of the most important things that comes out of that from a classic sort of Christian theological frame then is that the incarnation is this deep validation of the meaning, the value of the substance of the earth, of the nature of what it means to be human, of the significance of what it is to be engaged in relationships of many different kinds, and to share in the work that God intends and cares for in the world. So everything about a biblical framework that would understand the significance of human identity, the value of individual human lives and of collective human experience and expression, all arises out of that deep sense that there is a God who sees us, who has made us, who fashions us, who weighs our life with the greatest possible seriousness, so much so that, in fact, that God comes to identify with us, to perceive it. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Then the next major movement is this sense that we are made in the image of God with the capacity to pay attention to God, to ourselves, to our neighbor, and to the world. This is the great biblical affirmation of what the classic language of stewardship actually pertains to. So the sense of being human in a biblical frame is to be people who pay attention to the God who holds all things, and then to pay attention to ourselves as creatures made in God's image, to our neighbor, friend, foe alike, and ultimately to the earth itself. And then that's what brings us then to the final strophe of this psalm, which is this sense that we then pay attention to the world in God's name. The language that's used here in Psalm 8 is language that describes a sense of attentiveness to the natural order, to the humans, to the animal life, for example, around us. But in a larger sense, what the psalmist is pointing to is this greater sense that human beings have in some profound way, by the God who holds all things, been entrusted with significant responsibility to attend to ourselves, our neighbor, and the world that God has made. Now, any understanding from a Christian point of view of vocation or calling then arises out of this frame. It's all set in this larger frame. Who is God? What is God's claim and desire for us as human beings? What does it mean for us as human beings to take the world with the greatest possible seriousness? The first great liberty of a Christian theology of vocation is to acknowledge that this is really God's idea, not our own. This is a gift from a Christian point of view because it actually liberates us from a suggestion that somehow we woke up one day and thought we should just take charge of everything. That's not really a biblical vision of the way that things are ordered. Instead, it's really a sense that to be people who take our work, our minds, our bodies, our world, our neighbors, in all of their neediness and circumference seriously, is to actually enter into something which is God's initiative and project in the first strophe. So it's really this amazing sense that we are participants in a responsibility, a vision, a task, which is really finally not ours to carry. This is partly why the Old Testament scriptures or Hebrew scriptures make so much of the importance of Sabbath keeping. Sabbath keeping is a deliverance from a bad theology of vocation and calling. It's really to say you should never be trusted to be more than 6 days out from laying down every significance of your own productivity, your own ability, your own capacity to exercise influence in the world. Never trust yourselves to be more than 6 days out from laying down every sign of your deployment in the world. You are not actually the people who have been given responsibility for the universe. You are not the people who are keeping the universe going. Even in Washington, D.C., you are not given that responsibility. So there's this great liberty of a theology of Sabbath that says, oh, Sabbath keeping is the great frame on anything that we want to go on to say about vocation. Is there meaning to our labor? Absolutely. Is it significant and important that we use our gifts and abilities, that we take seriously the opportunity that we have as a result of being made in God's image with this capacity to which we're called? Absolutely. All those things matter. And they have a boundary which only God actually finally holds, and which we do not as human beings, even in some, hold. So the great liberty is never be more than 6 days out before you stop your work, lest you be seduced by believing that your call, your vocation, your tasks really suggest that you are the one that's actually holding the universe together, that you are the one who's actually making sure that all things are being made right, that you are the one in whom all things are living and moving and having their being. That is called delusion, not vocation. So by all means, be free from such delusion and lay down the implements of your labor in order to remember that God is the one who holds all reality. That is it's a marvelous vision of what it means to understand our call rightly. Now, in the book, what I'm trying to do is to take this large biblical frame and say, if we go to the pages of the New Testament, what we find is really just an intensification of what I've just described. God is a God who doesn't just pay attention to us in the way that it's revealed in what we would call the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. That vision of God is a God who sees us in our need, who understands the meaning of our labor, our relationships, their chaos and their disorder, their pain and their possibility. All of that is seen by a God who then identifies with that, as the New Testament suggests, in the incarnation. God comes to actually be part of the world where such work needs to be done, and where you and I are given the privilege of, in some way, measuring and entering into that great labor, which takes the sum of the world and the universe seriously enough to give our whole selves to that task. And we do it in a whole variety of different ways. But we do it, again, in the broad frame through the intensification of the way that this is made known in the God who comes to us in Jesus Christ. This is the New Testament claim. And whether we accept or reject that claim is what frames then what goes on to occur in the ministry and life of Jesus. And what's fascinating is that beginning, middle, and end, the call that is the primary call is the call, put quite simply in the language of Jesus, which is simply two words: follow me. It's a fascinating thing that this primary call is primary, not because it's a discharging of every possible detail of what our call or vocation might look like, but because it's as though Jesus is really saying, initially in a very simple way to his disciples, but in a way that will be repeated multiple times over the course of each of the Gospels, this sense that you will find yourself, you will find the meaning of your life, you will find the significance of your work, you will find the significance and shape of your relationships, you will see the healing of the world, you will take the realities of justice and peace most seriously if you actually follow me. Now, sometimes that phrase has been reduced to something much smaller than Jesus intends. It becomes a kind of myopic vision, as though the whole universe is being closed into something very small, as though it is a kind of fussy religious project. That's not, I think, a faithful reading or a thoughtful reading, honestly, of the Gospels. What I think is happening is just the opposite. To follow Jesus is not to be wrongly obsessed with one person as though it is a form of what Old Testament scriptures especially might call idolatry. It's actually to enter through a portal which then gives us the capacity to be able to see ourselves and our neighbor and our world even more profoundly and clearly. This is at least the Christian claim. And again, whether you accept or reject that claim, that is the nature of the claim, that the portal through which we both most profoundly see God is also the portal through which we most profoundly see ourselves. And our ability to be able to understand our neighbor and the complexity of the world that we live in and the significance of human suffering and relationships, the longing for human love, for the value of human energy and capacity and creativity and imagination and discovery and investigation, all of those things find their portal in the God who has now become known, incarnate in Jesus Christ. That's the radical Christian claim. And therefore, we come to understand ourselves and understand our neighbor and see our work most meaningfully by seeing it through the lens of being followers of Jesus. That's the New Testament claim. It's not about then turning all of us into religious, as the Roman Catholic tradition would say, or all of us into ordained clergy, as Protestants might say, or all of us into Presbyterian elders, as some of us might say, but instead, much more radically and much more importantly, we are all meant to become most truly and authentically human by the act of following Jesus. And it's in that act that we then come to see ourselves and see our neighbor and the world in all of its extraordinary complexity and beauty and neediness through the humanity and divinity of Jesus, who gives us a window into a picture of our real humanity. And what does it mean to be followers of Jesus? It's ultimately to find and live into our fullest human identity. We are meant by becoming followers of Jesus not to become less human, but to become truly human. This is the heart of the radical claim, which is why then it's a claim that in Christian terms extends to people of every tribe and tongue and nation, not in a kind of hegemonic, power-aggressive takeover, but in an acknowledgement that the claim is that there is something so distinctly unique about the character of what God has made known in Christ that we find our humanity in Him and through Him. And we also then find the humanity, the diversity, the neediness of the world that we are a part of. And it's through that mystery that then we enter into Psalm 8, knowing a God who pays attention to us. This is how God pays attention in Jesus Christ. And then what does it mean to pay attention to God? It means following Jesus and realizing as we do so that we now see God more clearly, a God that's not a God of a single tribe, but a God of the world, a God who has a capacity to take our life, our humanity, the world's complexity with the greatest seriousness, and to do something about it which ultimately turns the New Testament claims on the uniqueness of what Jesus alone is capable of doing for us in a way that we cannot do for ourselves. But then as followers, we actually then make the third stroke of the psalm, which turns us back toward the world and our neighbor and says, and now, through Jesus Christ, we come back into the world and look at our skills, our abilities, the world's need, the passions and heart of God, who longs for a world of shalom, who longs for a world of justice, who longs for a world in which human flourishing can occur. And through that process, we're then invited into the broad landscape of God's vision, which Jesus calls the kingdom of God, in which in that world there's a possibility of relationships being healed, of broken individual identities being renewed, of the possibilities of families being restored, of a human identity being reclaimed, of justice being discovered in every tribe and tongue and nation. Again, this vision of a kind of ultimately cosmic shalom, in which, in the right language of the Apostle Paul, all things are made right. This is an amazing vision. So then we have our job. Now we come to the job part. But you can see, having reframed it then, that the job is not actually the main agenda. The job is part of a broader agenda. And we then come to the job, which does really matter, in which we work in certain places, do certain tasks, exercise certain labor, carry out certain responsibility. And we do that out of a deep sense that this God, who's involved in this great drama and has invited and welcomed us to have a place in that drama, has also given us part of our human development and identity is our gifts and abilities and capacities and curiosities and questions and answers and investigations, all of which is part of our expression of our human life. And then if we're serious about seeking to also be a follower of Jesus, then gets refined and dialed in ways that may land us in certain places and certain times to be able to make a certain sort of impact as a result of the way in which we've been perhaps uniquely made with a particular set of abilities and a particular inclination toward some part of a vast landscape of need in the world to which you and I are given the opportunity, the possibility of being able to make a response. Now, it's in light of all that, then, that we can come to this question of what is our work to be? Well, in the frame that I've just suggested, our work is to carry out localized pieces of that great task. And we do it in the context of every possible work discipline. Our calling is to be followers of Jesus, who then, through that primary call, are led into all kinds of places of work and investigation and discovery, where in those contexts, in light specifically of being a follower of Jesus, we're now trying to be a person and an individual in community in which we understand that our vocation is not individual so much as it is communal. And in the context of a community of people who are seeking to offer their gifts, our strengths and our weaknesses, our capacities and our incapacities, our competencies and our incompetencies, we bring all of those things to the task of living as fully human, genuinely human lives as we can. We take policy seriously, we take law seriously, we take social practice seriously, we take social and political issues seriously, we take economic issues seriously, we take religious and spiritual issues seriously, we take biological issues seriously, right? Every domain belongs under this great vision. And we each participate in that in our own particular and unique way. But we do so because this vocational sense of call then means that we, as a community of people, are invited to become followers of Jesus. And as any who choose to become followers of Jesus do so, we become part of this great cadre of other people across time and history and around the world, of every tribe and tongue and nation, and every caste and every class. And as we carry that work out, we have the opportunity to participate in the great work of God in the world. Now, often, and tragically and painfully, this has become the source, and sometimes in the life of the church, of great hubris, of pride, of arrogance. It's a suggestion that the church is the only agency of God in the world, and that the church is the only agency by which God is doing anything in the world. And the Christian people are the people that have the corner on the will of God, and the people that have the corner on the call of God. I think that's actually a dramatic miscaricature of what it is that's actually happening in the world. God is going to do what God chooses to do. And God has given rich and abundant gifts to people, whether they are confident believers or whether they're not. But the New Testament, I think, loudly and clearly makes evident that the key to the deepest understanding of what it means to be human, as the New Testament presents it, is really known in Christ. And it's discovered in humility, not in pride. And it's exercised best in brokenness, not in arrogance or competency, which is why the New Testament makes so much about the fact that, ironically, the best way of understanding vocation is actually the cross. Now, this is really awkward in a context in which usually competency is prized more than death, and usually power is prized more than weakness, and usually prominence is prized more than ignominy. And all of that is the irony by which the New Testament turns a theology, a practice of vocation on its head. It's not because there isn't a place for achievement, competition, capacity, ability to gain and use your gifts. But because one of the most profound things that the Bible says, in addition to Sabbath, the need to lay down the productivity of our lives, the most subversive thing to a common social practice of jobs and work, especially in a dominant cultural setting, especially in the West, especially among educated people, especially when economic times allow us the prerogative of choice, especially when we're not going to spend 6 hours a day getting water, especially when we don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to feed our children. In other words, when among the people who have the prerogatives of thinking philosophically about call and vocation, we naturally are prone to think in a culture of success that it's really defined by how do we make sure that we achieve in our vocation. I think that's a legitimate thing, provided, however, that it is filtered through the lens of an understanding that Jesus says, if you're going to follow me, in Matthew chapter 16, he says, not only am I going to a cross, but in fact, you're going to one. And you will live out your vocation by taking up a cross and following me. Now, suddenly, we've moved back to what may feel to some like religious territory, as though now we're just talking again about religion. And I want to suggest that we're not yet really talking about religion. We're talking about human vulnerability. We're talking about genuine self-giving love. We're talking about the capacity to seek someone else's welfare more than our own welfare. This is the great theme of the New Testament, that Jesus' vision is not how do I maximize the real you. Just turns out that's not really the New Testament vision. It doesn't turn out that Jesus spends a lot of time to figure out how to be the most that you could possibly be. That's just not where the weight of the New Testament rests. It's really more to say, how do you offer all that you are and all that you aren't, and then respond to a God who holds all things, who actually has come to offer all that God is in Christ to a world who will discover the reality of God's depth most clearly in brokenness. Now, suddenly, this is the great turn in our understanding of vocation and calling, because so often in conversations about vocation and calling, it's sort of, how do I take my capacities? How do I maximize my education? How do I make sure that my trajectory is on an upward, ever upward, ever upward kind of mode? And suddenly, then, we run into this theme of saying, oh, there's something else going on here, peculiarly, unexpectedly awkward. It's not, I think, about stepping away from achievement. It's not about stepping away even from competition. It's not about stepping away from success. It's about something much more costly than that, which is actually taking all of those good things and somehow determining how we're going to lay them down and make them an offering and not a trophy. Now that is to subvert the energy of a great deal of vocational and calling language, which is really much more about how do I win rather than how do I offer. These are huge, different themes. And they are themes that I think are dominant in the New Testament understanding of vocation. So we take the great achievements, and in this room, I dare say there are many people who have achieved all kinds of things. And the question that's at the core of a Christian way of holding that is, how do I hold that in such a way that it doesn't control me, that it's not an idol, that it's not a destination, it's not as though my life is made of, in fact, this achievement. But I hold it honestly and with vulnerability. And I, in some sense, whether in real fact or in my spirit, I hold it very open-handedly. I'm not made by these things. I'm not designed to be this. I'm actually designed to hold these things in trust, this achievement, this status, this role, this function, this capacity, this ability, and I do it open-handedly toward my neighbors, my colleagues, my workers, the society and world around me. I hold it open-handedly. I remember James Baker telling the story about one day after he was Secretary of State, driving along the streets of D.C., and this was a story he told afterwards, but it was while he was Secretary of State. He was driving along, and he saw a profile of someone walking on the street that caught his eye, and he looked again and saw that it was, as he was whirling along in his own motorcade, he was looking at a former Secretary of State. And he said, I need to remember, that's me. Now, if we can be Secretary of State and remember that that's me, if we can hold the responsibility that we really have and remember that's really also me, and not the role, not the function, not the capacity, not the achievement, not the success, we start holding these things in ways that I think are really quite different, and which enable us to then turn toward a world of extreme need and complexity, in which our very best skills are needed, but which we never delude ourselves into thinking we are the maker of the universe, or the redeemer of the universe, or the fixer of even our local project. We are the people who are seeking to hold what has first been given to us by the God who pays attention to us, and who calls us to center our lives in paying attention to that God. And then calls us to, now, I want you to turn toward the world, and I want you to see your neighbors in all of their raw reality. I want you to see your enemies. I want you to see the material and physical world of the natural universe that we are a part of, and I want you to attend to it in my name. And it's that threefold kind of pattern which it seems to me holds the call of being a follower of Jesus, intensified, personalized, made graphic through the life and ministry of Jesus, and which is now meant to be extended out into the world through the church really living into this. So the crisis is this, as I subtitled the book, the crisis of the calling is that we're just taken up with other things, with other agendas, cultural, or even ecclesial. We're embedded often, many of us who would claim Christian faith, would find ourselves embedded in what I've come to think of as the ecclesiastical industrial complex. This sense that we're just caught up in this thing called the church, when in fact the source and character and identity of the church is actually much more profound than that, and it's about being a daily follower of Jesus, which then links us to community, not to the ecclesiastical industrial complex, which is just an expression of the body of Christ, but by no means the same. So part of it is that, and part of the crisis then is that as a consequence of our disconnection from the Jesus who's the center of this vocation, is a sense that then we just operate around structural and institutional identity, distant from the one who is actually its source, and distant from the edginess, which I think Jesus is a whole lot more interested in than the church has ever tended to be. And as a result, the gospel is disconnected from the one that we're meant to follow. And then secondly, it leads to a division between faith and practice, which is the great crisis that the church faces, I would say, in many parts of the world, where what we say and what we do are two radically different things. And the shock of Pope Francis is really the shock of, oh my gosh, who would have ever believed? Out of nowhere comes an authentic disciple, right in the midst of the most ecclesiastical industrial complex that there is in the world. And yet, in his authenticity and simplicity and clarity, there is for him a shock that this is a shock. We need to share that shock about the shock that Pope Francis does not seem to be the normative Christian. When I would suggest that really in the language that I've been trying to talk about tonight, the normative Christian is meant to be a person who in the midst of power, authority, success, prominence, fame, or ordinary human life is meant to simply be an authentic expression of the love and presence and mercy and justice of God, who sees our world, who calls us to pay attention to the God who sees us, and then says, now I want you to just go out into the world, in the places where you live and work and play, and attend to that world with the capacity to demonstrate the reality of that kind of God. So the crisis is that we're not doing that. The promise is that if we want to recover this kind of vocation and calling, then it calls us deeper into the life of God and deeper into the life of the world. And that seems to me to be exactly where we belong. Let me stop there and invite you to see if you have any questions or comments or tomatoes or anything else that people may want to send my way. I think that microphones are going to be brought to you, so as you raise your hand, a microphone will be brought, and then you can ask your question. Thank you. I think there was a hand right there.
Hi. I'm curious how the writing of this book was different from your time at John Stott Ministries and working with people in the developing world and understanding their experience of following Jesus.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. When I worked for John Stott Ministries, the work that I was doing there on the board and also earlier than that, working as John's study assistant, was work of trying to see and understand the church in the majority world, where so many of the prerogatives of choice, which I've implied throughout what I've shared tonight, are simply not available. I mean, when it is the case that you're spending 6 hours a day just getting water for your family, or you're just trying to figure out whether or not you're going to be able to eat that day, that's a really different world than the world in which we are exercising the freedom to be able to make all kinds of decisions about, do I want to eat this or do I want to eat that, and which bottled water will I choose, rather than whether I will have water. So part of it is just the profound difference in acknowledging that the circumstances, the premises are completely different than are true for many, many people around the world. And at the same time, not trying to acknowledge that in such a way that it stops us from being able to go on and ask the appropriate questions, which is, how are we stewards of what we have been given, rather than how do we measure ourselves against what some in the world don't experience. So I think that was one of the differences. I think another difference was realizing that, that with that comes the freedom and the prerogative of making so many other choices. And with that, frankly, a burden, right? I mean, my wife was a high school English teacher for many years. She worked at a public high school with highly capable students. And as a result, she each year had to finally limit the number of colleges that she would fill out applications for each student to 10 per student. And she would limit the total number of students that she would do this for to a roughly 25 or 30. If she had left that uncapped, it would have been something more like maybe 20 schools, 15 to 20 schools, and it would have been probably twice the number of students. All of that's available as an exercise of what they might see, if they were to use the word language of call or vocation, as part of what they're trying to achieve. And the disparity between those two things is dramatic. So I think in the writing, I was just really aware of the differences between those two things. I think one of the great disruptive influences of seeking to be a Jesus follower is that we are meant to carry the reality of the whole world in our minds and in our hearts, not just the reality of my own personal circumstances. I want to decide what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus today in light of realities which are not my social circumstances, not my sociology, but really a much greater vision of the world and a much greater vision of God's heart for the world. Thank you. Yes? We're going way down the road.
My brother wants me to ask you about string theory, but,
Yes,
but I
yes.
think
I'll wax on that another time, but not tonight.
Okay.
Although it wouldn't take long for me to wax on it.
I have a comment, but I'm trying to rephrase it in the form of a question. So I guess my question occurred to me as you were talking about not getting caught up in success. I can't phrase it as well as you did, but the idea that it's so easy for people, especially in this culture, to get caught up in their identity as being tied to their success and how others view them. But you can also just as easily, I think, get tied up, or let me rephrase it, could you also as equally get tied up in the reverse of if you experience failure or rejection, disappointment, could you get, if you're so tied up in your identity with what other people think of you or your success, could you get dragged down too low?
Yes.
By being so affected by failing or being rejected, that's also an indication that you're not really following Christ as closely as you
Yes, there's a
could.
generosity in the
Right.
way that we can get hung up, right? You name the direction and the pull, and there could be many other pulls added to the two that you've suggested, any one of which can become, I think, really distracting. This is why the simple and remarkable affirmation, again, of the New Testament is that we find our deepest human life in a God of unexpected and unexplained love, whether through success or failure, capacity or incapacity, maleness or femaleness, Jewishness or Gentileness, right? You name the category, and it's not the barrier or the definition of what it means to live in the context of the communion of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it's really in that freedom that we're meant to find our deepest identity. Now, frankly, we don't really like that because we kind of like making our identity. This is what causes the industry of identity making to be so multifaceted and so fed by such a voracious desire, right? We can find all kinds of ways of simply making our life. Now, the interesting thing is, I would say the Bible says, no, by all means, use your life in whatever way you can, and give it away, and in a great way that may cause you success. Don't be deluded. Failure, don't be deluded, et cetera, right? You can lose your way in a hall of mirrors in which you start trusting the wrong markers of your identity, and it exists across the spectrum. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, there's a question up here.
Thanks, Mark, for your great insights, as always. We're members of the National Presbyterian Church. You mentioned Presbyterian. You preached at our church. In January, we have a series of classes. And I went to one conducted by 3 psychologists over 3 weeks. And the subject of forgiveness came up. And that ran into a bit of a snag with all that's going on internationally and domestically and Selma and everything. So how do you handling forgiveness with your students?
Yeah. Well, let's start in a very salty place, which is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, it's no great credit to you if you love those who love you, but whether you love those who don't love you, and in fact those who are even your enemies. If we had longer, which we don't, there would be much more to say about this, but I'll just say that I think that what is happening in that text throughout the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew, is Jesus' framing of what it means to live as people who are becoming participants in the kingdom of God, which is the reestablishment of a new humanity, of every tribe and tongue and nation, of a new sociology, of a new vision of what it means to be in relationship, of a reordering of power, etc., right? All kinds of things are happening in the Sermon on the Mount, which is why it feels so faintly inadequate for someone to say, that they find the Sermon on the Mount inspiring. It's not inspiring, it's defeating. It's overwhelming, because Jesus is actually saying, I want you to live in a way that is not instinctive to any human being and is not instinctive to any particular tribe or culture or religion, for that matter. I want you to live in a way that's distinctive to the kingdom of God and an expression of the uniqueness of the love of God. So when he says, I want you to love not just those who love you, but those who are even your enemies, it comes, I think, at the high point in chapter 6 of Matthew, where Jesus is really saying, in other words, I want you to reorder the way that you understand all relationships. And it's going to be redefined by something which is really quite different than you would expect. Now, these things have to be teased out in a more nuanced way than I'm able to do tonight. But I will say this, that I think that the church has not really faced that we follow an enemy-loving God. If we're people who identify with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God made known in Jesus Christ, then we are people who are following an enemy-loving God. That is a very, very uncomfortable reality. And it calls us to a different way of understanding our enemy. It doesn't say that we don't have enemies. That's not what's being said. It's not, oh, there really aren't enemies, we should just all really love each other. No, actually, it's way, way, way more radical than that. There are really enemies. There are people who seek the destruction of the world and of other people. And there are people that we should, therefore, somehow, by the grace of God, grow in our capacity to love. Anyone volunteering to do this? Anyone have the capacity to do this? I think in honesty, we have to say no to both. We don't have the instinct and we don't have the capacity. Do we have the calling? This is partly what I was referring to in a way about the vocation of the cross. We get to love our neighbor through a capacity not to diminish the enemy, but to somehow hold the enemy in a different way. Now that's where we can make significant headway. So if that's the gold standard, let's not defeat ourselves and write it off by saying we haven't reached the gold standard. Maybe we could start by loving people who annoy us as a starter. What about people who we just find irritating? Like, that would be a good thing. Maybe they live in our house, either one. What if we just decided, okay, I don't have to love my enemy today, but I should start loving people who annoy me. There's a thought. Or irritate me, or disappoint me, or offend me. I'm not yet anywhere near enemy territory. But if I'm taking that call seriously, and if I'm taking the call to grow in my capacity to live into that vocation, then I can actually grow in those ways. I think of a friend of mine a number of years ago when just after 9/11, Rich Mao, who was then the president of Fuller Seminary, hosted a number of Muslim scholars who came to Fuller to study Protestantism in America. They spent 2 weeks at Yale and 2 weeks at Fuller, and while they were at Fuller, he turned over his outer offices for these imams from various parts of the world to come and pray in the outer offices of his collection of rooms. And I thought this was really a wonderful thing that had happened, and that it happened so soon after 9/11, and I couldn't help, somewhat in a catty way, wonder what some donors of Fuller Seminary would think if they knew right after 9/11 that there were these people praying in the outer rooms of Rich Mao, the president of Fuller Theological Seminary's office. So it happened later that day. I was with a friend of mine who has frequently been the victim of a militant Islamic force, who's been imprisoned multiple times, who's been beaten many times, whose life and whose family's life has been hugely affected by militant Islam. And I ran into him and I said, so I wonder, did you know that this had happened? He said, no, I wasn't aware that was going on. I said, so what do you think about the fact that he turned over his outer offices to these imams to pray in? He said, well, it's nothing to give them a room. We're supposed to give them our lives. Right, I said, that was precisely what I was thinking. I was thinking it's about giving them our lives. That was my response. I'm sure that was my response. I was all about giving them our lives. No, that was not, of course, my response. And it was not how I saw that moment. And while I was enthused that he had done it, I had not been, as my friend has been, the victim of a whole pattern of abuse in his part of the world, which has put himself and his family in jeopardy. And he has the capacity to say, oh, it's not a big deal to give them a room. We are meant to give them our lives. And suddenly, before me, is a living example of somebody who's a lot farther down the road than I am in practicing this unexpected vocation to practice forgiveness and love and generosity of heart and mind, which is not instinctive to me and which is not easy for anyone, and which, it turns out, some actually come to know. And I think they come to know it in part through the generosity of sharing and following Jesus, who is like that, and living in that way in relationship to the world in a way that's taught him that. Yes, some more questions up here.
I come in contact with a large number of people coming out of a military background who I think sense the God-shapedness within them of this desire to serve.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At the same time, and culturally, we are being drugged in such a secular direction that oftentimes their response to what we might elevate their sights to calling, as exactly you've described it, about the most that they can come up with is, I want to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you have captured so much of this tonight. Can you contrast how you might communicate in that sort of a situation, the difference between such a different, I would argue, lower standard of somehow just making a difference, and what it really means to live?
Yeah. Let me try this. You'll see in the book that one of the themes that I developed that I think is quite important to our understanding of where we are as a church in North America in particular is an acknowledgement that we're moving from a period of Christendom to a period of exile, from a period in which the church really is surrounded by social structures and affirmations and patterns and habits in which the church is largely validated, if not actually received and affirmed, into a context in which now we really live as a church in exile, as people who live as strangers in a strange land. That's a very, very different circumstance. And it's partly, I think, what you mean by the drift of greater and greater secularization. One way that that secularization's happened is that it's recontextualized the church. It's both exposed really the secularity of the church, in part, which is worth humbly acknowledging, and also acknowledging that beyond that, there's a secularization that has become much more common and broadly accepted, and that makes the church then an even more distinct and peculiar community. So the idea of making a difference is to live in two different worlds. If I think I'm trying to make a difference in a context which is largely a Christendom-defined context, then I have a certain set of expectations. But if in fact the context in which I'm meant to make a difference is actually a context in which the church is really a church in exile, then I'm not actually trying to take us back to Christendom. I'm trying to acknowledge that in that exilic setting, I'm trying to live as a faithful expression of the God that I serve, trying to demonstrate the reality of what that love and mercy and justice is about. And I try to do it in a way that humbly serves, or in the language of Jeremiah, seeks the welfare of the city, for in its welfare, that is, in the welfare of the enemy, I will find my welfare. Now, that's completely different than the instincts of a church in Christendom. In a church in Christendom, you say and you expect that largely the broad reality is going to affirm what I am affirming. In an exilic church, the church actually seeks to try to love and nurture the enemy, for in their welfare will come the welfare of the church. So making a difference is going to look radically different. It means I have to think harder, pray harder, consider more deeply. What does it mean to find my peculiar way of making a contribution? I would commend to you and to them a book like the Book of Daniel, which I think is written exactly on this theme. What does it mean to live as strangers in a strange land? What does it mean to remember who we are when we live in Nebuchadnezzar's house, who's given over to everything possible to assimilate us? How do we remember our identity? How do we, chapter 2, remember what it means to actually trust God for something which we are not capable of, but which God alone could provide, as in the dream with Nebuchadnezzar? And in chapter 3, for example, what does it mean in Daniel chapter 3 to remember that the greater danger is not the fire that Nebuchadnezzar threatens to say you must conform and bow down to the golden idol that I've created, but what does it mean instead to be unhooked from that system and realize that the greater danger is idolatry, not death? Now, those are handles, I think, on then figuring out in our ordinary circumstances what our practice of our identity is, what it means to trust God distinctively for something which God can alone do, and for being able to distinguish the greater and the lesser danger. So those are examples to me of where we find clues in how we can actually live distinctively, make a difference for a church that's in exile, rather than how do we try to take a secular culture and force it back into a Christendom box, which as far as I can tell is just not on the agenda of social reality. Yeah.
Mark,
Oh, yes.
how is your understanding of vocation that you've laid out here from Psalm 8? A couple things. How is that affecting the way that you carry out your vocation as the president of Fuller, and the way you shape the educational experience of those who are students at Fuller, not just in the School of Divinity, but in the School of Psychology and in the School of World Mission?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it does shape it very significantly. Often, for those of you who just need maybe a little refresher on the history of theological education has usually existed in the shadow of churches. So churches hand seminaries candidates. Seminaries do whatever that thing is that seminaries do, and then they hand them back to churches. That's sort of the model. But in that model, therefore, seminaries are primarily preparing people for church vocations inside and for and with the church and or Christian or nonprofit organizations. It turns out that at a school like Fuller, about 50% of our students come in wanting that sort of education, but about 50% of our students come to Fuller with no intention that they're going to serve in a pastoral setting or in a Christian ministry setting. They actually are going into government, politics, business, media, arts, etc. And they come to Fuller because they want more biblical and theological education in order to be able to go out and serve in whatever their calling may be. So to me, Psalm 8 creates that great canvas because it says God wants us as human beings to be attentive to the whole of the created order. That involves every gift and capacity to extend into the world, that it's not the prerogative of just what happens kind of in the precincts of the institutional church or religious formalism, but instead how do we actually practice our vocation in light of whatever it is? So I think lifting that up and then creating a curriculum, a commitment as an institution toward the preparation of people, as we are now saying, Fuller seeks to form Christian leaders who are going to exercise global kingdom vocations. Global because we realize it happens against a backdrop of the world, globalized world. Kingdom because we're saying it's not just the church, but really the reign of God in and through whatever means. And it's for vocations of all different kinds, which don't just involve kind of classical Christian jobs, but really the Christian life carried out in every kind of job. So I think it's seminal. Thanks. Yes?
Thank you for coming and talk to us tonight. I was wondering, one of the words you mentioned quite a bit tonight is the word love. I was wondering if you could give me your definition of love.
Well, I'll use as the definition of love a person. And the person that I'm wanting to name, I suppose, first and foremost, is really the Trinity. I mean, a Christian vision of God, this is why Trinitarian theology matters, for those of you who have long since forgotten or neglected or been turned off by such language. I can't think of a more profound way of affirming at the very core that God is love, and that part of the reason that the Bible, I believe, affirms that is because of God's triune nature, in which, as God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there is perfect communion, unity, diversity, affirmation, truth, and it's really out of that that God the Son comes to display the reality of that love. And that love, then, is an embodied, tangible, personal, sacrificial expression. And I can't think that love could ever be defined, even if it was defined in a non-Trinitarian way. I think many of those words would have to appear, right? It would have to be embodied and personal and sacrificial and self-giving in ways that are, that I would say, are most profoundly expressed in the life and ministry of Jesus and in the nature of God's revelation in and through the Bible and in and through Jesus most specifically. Which is why following Jesus is to live a life of love, which is often not what happens. Anyway, I think there were some hands up here.
2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions.
The ecclesiastical industrial complex. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And particularly, you were a part of what may be dubbed that in terms of being a part of your church.
Yes,
at least a reasonably sized church in Berkeley. What did that look like? How did it hinder God's project in the world?
Well, so you come to the pages of the New Testament, and what you see is this organic, personal interaction and connection with Jesus and with each other. And then you go on into the New Testament, and you see the way in which the formal and, in any case, more patterned expressions of the church begin to emerge. And then you come into post-New Testament writing and history, and you see a thicker and thicker and thicker layer of a buildup of church practice and history, which is all meant in its very best instincts to point back to its origins, but which my feeling is often becomes a crust that actually almost imprisons the dynamic of the very core of the mystery and life and dynamic that was the birth of what the Jesus movement, if you want to use that phrase, was really meant to be. And then we come along 2,000 years later, completely separated from perhaps any knowledge or awareness of that whole long history. We sort of encounter this thing called the church. It has buildings, it has mortgages, it has parking lots, it has marketing people, it has, it's big about the whole audio production thing. You have people that do things called worship production manager on some church staffs. You have regalia, you have etc., right? That's what makes me call it the ecclesiastical industrial complex. There's this whole thing, and at its very best, it does faithfully witness to this authentic center. But that is always in jeopardy, Marshall McLuhan, because the message, the medium rather, is so thick that it's really unclear to me whether people actually hear the message. This is, I think, again, what makes Pope Francis such an interesting example. Boom, out of this ecclesiastical industrial thickness, partly through the gift of media in this case, comes just as a person, a singular person who just listens, it turns out, who actually receives the child that asks the awkward question, that doesn't stand in formalism and distance but identification, right? It's an amazing, suddenly penetrating evidence of something that I would suggest people of many religions and cultures and languages long for, right? So the fact that that is a shock is itself to me the shock, because in the language of Jesus that should be normative. But when people look at the church and talk about the church and hear about the church, that's often not what they think. And that's what feels to me like it's the thickness. So as a pastor, I remember this one time on Sabbath themes, for example, we were having a conversation about the need to try to determine how could we instill in this manically competent congregation practices of Sabbath keeping in which we're deluded into believing that the world really does depend on us in some sort of way. And so we started talking about just our Sunday schedule and what we would have to extract in order to be able to have Sunday be recovered as a day of rest at our church. All the things that we would have to stop doing on Sunday if we were going to actually make it a day of rest for families and individuals. And before we were done, we realized we can't do that. And the reason we can't do it isn't because it couldn't be done, but because it was such a dismantling of the whole thing that I remember this moment where I just sort of cried out, I just want to start all over, by which I did not mean that day or that meeting, but really from the beginning. Let's go back to the first century. This is obviously what has often been a repetitive instinct, right, in reform movements in the Christian church, has been this longing not to get back to some sort of fantastical and even illusory first century life as though it was free from its complexities, which any reading of the New Testament would never suggest it was, but because it just feels like the accretions are so thick and so many that how it is that we actually learn to practice this feels hugely problematical. And that is the crisis, and that's partly why it feels to me like it's going to come about, whatever the revolution or reformation should be, it comes about by, I think in the initial sense, becoming clearer and more regular in our practice of this central and primary call. If I went back to saying, am I first and foremost every day, in every context, simply seeking to be a follower of Jesus, I would at least begin to reorient the clarion center that's meant to determine how I live otherwise.
Just building on the principle of Sabbath, as Christians, how would you define the concept of work-life balance? And what do you feel are some principles we should be thinking about?
Well, this is a gigantic subject, of course, as everything we've been talking about tonight is, but it is a gigantic subject. But I'll just throw out a few things that it seems to me are important. I do think Sabbath keeping is really important. And with Sabbath keeping comes, in general, the desire to live unhooked. This is Daniel chapter 3, the greater danger. Is it idolatry? Is it fire? We have to acknowledge and think seriously in our own vocation, where are we hooked and why are we hooked? What is the fear against which, the drive in light of which we are calibrating our work, our productivity, our endlessness? What is that about? Where does that come from? Why are we hooked by it? What are we trying to fight? Ernest Becker suggested it was death. I think we're about many, many things that we're trying to work out through our jobs, our identity, our value, our meaning, our success, our prominence. We should surely think seriously about what are all those things about, and why are we hooked, and to what are we hooked? So I have my hooks. I have certain people often, when I do that sort of self-examination, like a prayer of examine, it's often a person in that particular day that hooked me in some way, where I was particularly vulnerable to wanting to be sure that when I went into that meeting, they were really impressed. And then I drive myself to be sure that that is accomplished. Well, it's at least worth asking why that matters, right? And so it goes across many different domains and fields. So I think that's another thing. I think that's Sabbath keeping in a different sense, that sort of I'm going to lay down the need to always be right, always be prepared, always be perfect, always be able, always be competent, always be successful. Anybody in the room have that set of appetites? So I think, again, that's, I think, a big part of it. I think another part of it is not just the negative side of what do we release, but really on the positive side, what do I want to give myself to? And there the calling that I think clarifies our work-life balance is, what is it that I want to be sure that I have really actually given myself to? The initiative, the compassion, the validation, the attentiveness that's going to witness to a God who sees the unseen. Do I spend any time, any day attending to people that are unseen? Do I spend any time, any day genuinely trying to give myself to something that's not my personal priority? Do I make time in my schedule for people who are the people that I want to avoid? There was an article in the New York Times a number of years ago about, in better economic times than perhaps today, about the growing popularity of private jet travel. And like many of these stories, it focused in on a widget maker who'd become a gazillionaire and who could therefore fly privately all that he wanted. And the interview went on to say that the turning point had happened apparently on one day when he was flying from the East Coast to the West Coast. And he said, if you can believe it, I was in first class, but there was a woman in business that had a baby that cried the whole way across the country. And that settled it for me. I just decided I'm never flying commercial again. And then he gave us his mission statement, which was this. He said, quote, because I realized that the really important thing to me is to exclude from my life anyone who might bum me out. Okay, let's just meditate on that for just a minute. Okay, because I've decided that the really important thing to me is to exclude from my life anyone who might bum me out. Now, when I first read this, I thought, that's just disgusting. And then about 30 seconds later, I thought, that's awkwardly familiar, actually. And while I don't practice it at the elite level that he does, is this not why I like having a phone with caller ID? Is this not what Mark Zuckerberg understood about friending and unfriending people rather seamlessly on Facebook? Is it not why administrative assistants would have needed to be invented if they didn't already exist? Because they exclude from our life people who might bum us out. And furthermore, it explains, at least in part, why I drive, and where I don't drive. It explains who I spend time with and who I don't spend time with. It explains what I do with my discretionary income and what I don't do with my, it explains what parts of the newspaper I read and what parts of the newspaper I don't. It explains who are people on the street that I see and people that I don't see, who are people that I stop for and people that I don't stop for. So I find that very awkward if I'm a follower of Jesus, because it turns out he didn't say, come to me unless you bum me out. He said, come to me, all you who really bum me out, and I will give you rest. And if we're going to live a life that in our workplaces and settings and neighborhoods and family and friends and public policy reflects the heart of the Jesus that some of us may claim that we seek to follow, then that's going to require a different set of instincts about how do I do what I really am made for, distinctively, peculiarly made for, because I belong to Jesus Christ. I think that's meant to be our end, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Much appreciated and much to discuss. I'm sure that raised lots of questions that weren't entirely answered during our time here. And want to announce the bar will reopen, so feel free to stick around, discuss some of those questions. Wanted just to thank Mark and to thank Fuller. It's been a real pleasure to work with you. Also to thank Bob Freiling and InterVarsity Press. It's always a pleasure to work with Bob and InterVarsity. Also just want to let you know that copies of the book called will be for sale. We'll be selling them right outside the Holman Lounge here in the lobby. Mark will be there and will be willing to sign copies that are purchased. Also just want to let you know that all proceeds from those sales will go directly to fund scholarships for students to Fuller. In addition, we will be offering a free copy of the book called for anyone who joins the Trinity Forum Society tonight. What is the Trinity Forum Society, you ask? So glad you did. The Trinity Forum Society is really the community of people who support the mission, purpose, and programs of the Trinity Forum. And as I mentioned before, part of what we try to do is provide the space, the opportunity, the resources, the thought leaders to help inspire the kind of reflection, deep conversation, and community that helps lead not only to personal renewal, but through that cultural renewal as well. So we would love to have you join us in this effort. There are also benefits to doing so. In addition to receiving your own copy of Called, one of the things we do offer are quarterly readings where we try to provide the best of literature and letters in history, along with an introduction explain why it's relevant today and the ongoing spiritual importance and transcendence of that. So different readings that you will see available and are also for sale out there. Examples like Dorothy Sayers' Why Work, different literature like Leo Tolstoy's How Much Land Does a Man Need, which explores transcendent and enduring themes. And so we invite you to avail yourself of that. In addition, we also offer our daily What We're Reading curated reading feed, as well as bi-monthly podcast interviews with thought leaders such as Mark and others. So we invite you to join us in that, and if you have questions, my colleagues at the Trinity Forum, Margaret Eberly, if you could just raise your hand there, is a great person to ask any of those questions. Feel free to grab me as well. In addition, if you had a question that wasn't answered, feel free to post it on our Facebook page, or again to tweet it, or just grab Mark while he's signing books or having wine. Finally, I just wanted to thank the people who made tonight possible at InterVarsity, at Fuller, and my own incredible colleagues at the Trinity Forum, Chloe Cuffle, Margaret Eberly, and our Crackerjack interns, James Cooper, Stuart Spooner, and Nathan Tolles. Thanks so much. Finally, thank you to all of you for coming. The bar is now open, and good night.